Welcome to new developments in Israel-Palestine and the role of the churches at St. Paul University. Welcome especially to those who are joining us online from across Canada and around the world, right now on the live stream and in the future through the recording. Welcome also to those of you who are present in this room this evening, and in particular to our panelists. My name is Sarah Kathleen Johnson. I am Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Pastoral Theology and Director of Anglican Studies here at St. Paul University. As we gather this evening, we acknowledge that this university is located on the traditional, unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We would like to honor the Anishinaabe, the first peoples of the lands and waters of the Kitchissippi-Ottawa River Valley, from time immemorial. We acknowledge that the site of the city of Ottawa serves as the home of the Anishinaabe, as a place for spiritual ceremonies and cultural gatherings and exchanges among First Peoples. Today, this spirit of peace and friendship is the foundation of relationships among Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples from around the world who now call this place home. Acknowledging the land on which we gather is an important starting point given the topic of this panel discussion. What is the role of Canadian churches in advocacy regarding Palestine? The university was grateful to receive and accept an invitation from the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa to host a public event as part of the commitment to advocacy made by Anglican and Lutheran leaders following a trip to Palestine and Israel earlier this year. This event is sponsored by Anglican Studies, the Faculty of Theology, and the Providence School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. The panel discussion this evening is informed by themes that participants raised online in the registration process. Specific questions raised online will be the focus of the final portion of the discussion. Participants who are present in person are also welcome to engage with the panelists at a reception in the atrium following the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Andreos, Dean of the Faculty of Theology at St. Paul University and moderator of the conversation this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Johnson. I also add my welcome to all of you and the distinguished members of the panel this evening. One Bishop Shane Parker mentioned the possibility earlier this year, a few months ago. We were so excited to host this conversation because it ties so well with the mission of our university. It's one of the axes of the strategic plan of our university is to work and educate our students for reconciliation among peoples. And so we are delighted you accepted to be here and delighted to host this conversation. The flow of the panel, that's my responsibility to introduce to you tonight, has 4 parts. In the first part, our speaker from a voice from Palestine, who's currently in the US, will speak about framing, give a brief introduction, what's going on, what do Palestinian Christians expect of Canadian churches. I hope that Jonathan Kutab is hearing me now. He's connected. We don't see him on the screen, but he's hearing us. The second part of the panel, 5 representatives of churches and organizations will speak about what their churches are doing for an advocacy work for peace, for just peace in Palestine and Israel. The third part will be a response from 2 individuals from a solidarity and advocacy perspective of an organization and from an academic perspective. And the fourth part is to respond to some questions that we collected during the registration period from all participants. We received more than 50 questions that we grouped and thematically, and that we will be addressing to specific members of the panel. So I will be introducing the members briefly before they speak for each section, and you can look for more information about their long bios on the website. If I read the whole bio, we won't have time left to hear about the topic. We want to hear from them, not about them. So our first speaker, as I mentioned, is Jonathan Kutab, a voice from Palestine. He's currently the executive director of Friends of Sabil in North America, an ecumenical Palestinian theological and advocacy and solidarity organization based in the US. Jonathan is a well-known international human rights attorney and co-founder of the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq and of Nonviolence International. Jonathan, I hope you're hearing me. يشرفنا جدا أنك قبلت دعوتنا هذا المساء للمشاركة في هذا اللقاء والحديث. شكرا جزيلا والكلمة لك.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you. First of all, I want to say that Palestinians and Palestinian Christians in particular...
the Palestinian voice in the panel.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. I want to start by thanking those of you, many of them probably on this call already, who have been working for many years to bring the interests of the Palestinians and their particular issues to the churches in Canada and to try and advocate on our behalf. Many of them have been working for many years to try and get their particular denominations, their conferences and assemblies to come out with proper statements and take up issues which reflect their belief and which respond to the calls of churches from Palestine in the Kairos document and other appeals where Palestinian Christians have appealed to our brothers and sisters in the West to deal with our issues. I will be remiss, however, if I don't point out that by and large we have been rather disappointed by the response, particularly of the leadership of most of the Canadian churches today. I can point out that many of the good resolutions that were taken by some general conferences have remained totally unimplemented. In fact, I came across an event where in 1973, in response to pushback by certain Zionist and Jewish groups, a high official of the church said, "I can't reverse the GC policy, but we don't have to implement it." Even mild resolutions. 2012, there was a resolution on BDS. 2015, there was a general conference resolution of the UCC that was just remained on the books and did not take any implementation effect. So, in fact, I understand the UCC even has on its books a resolution equating Zionism with racism that nobody is referring to anymore. But we are here at a very critical point, and I want to use the little time that I have to point out what some of the new changes that have been taking place in Palestine and how they impact the response and the role of the Canadian churches and what prevents them from carrying out policies, making statements, taking actions which they know to be required by the situation, but which they are afraid of implementing for a variety of reasons. The last year or so has seen a major spike in settler violence in the occupied territories. The number of cases, the severity of cases, the total impunity with which they are carried out, and the collaboration of the Israeli military forces with the settlers have reached unprecedented levels that we have not seen at all. And I'm talking not only about actions of the settlers, but also actions by the Israeli military. The statistics are there. I am sure you have read the reports and you are aware of the dire human rights situation. All I can say is it is now much, much worse, both in quality and quantity of violations. Secondly, there is now a widespread recognition of the demise of the two-state solution, a solution that for many years I myself have supported very strongly. But the facts on the ground by the different Israeli governments has led to the systematic erosion of even the possibility of creating a two-state solution. And now we are required to rethink the entire situation, to think out of the box, and to think how we can work towards a more just solution, because the two-state solution has become nothing but an empty alibi, allowing the status quo to continue. Third, the results of the recent elections have accelerated a trend that was there all along, but which now has become openly acknowledged by the Israeli government itself in its stated policies as well as its actions. For many years, the different Israeli governments of the right and of the left have tried to maintain a facade that the situation is a temporary one, that they are trying under difficult circumstances to manage the conflict, that they are waiting for the right Palestinian leadership, for enough international pressure, for the proper conditions on the ground to allow a change or to allow a two-state solution. Now we have a government that openly declares itself to be in favor of Jewish supremacy. We have ministers in the government who used to be not allowed even in the government by right-wing and Likud governments before. They are now in positions of power and they are openly declaring. One of them, for example, says, I am a fascist and a homophobe. That is who I am. Deal with it. I am democratically elected. I have been appointed by the people. I will openly carry out the policies which I believe I want to carry out. Fourth, there is now an open recognition by the international human rights community, as well as by an awareness of a majority of Israelis, that the current situation in all of Palestine, not just the occupied territory, is a situation of apartheid, where being Jewish is what matters, whether you're living in a settlement in the occupied territory or in the Negev or in the Galilee, in Israel itself, or in Jerusalem. That the issue is Jewish supremacy and not coexistence with another people. The very word equality is one of the most subversive ideas that can be offered in Israel today. So, with this widespread recognition of apartheid, we also have to deal with a new reality that changes in public opinion in the churches as well as in the general population, including in the United States and Canada, have become quite substantial, and the church is asked now to live up to its own principles and to at least keep up with the movement of history when they should be leading that movement. By contrast, the other side has decided that it may have well lost the public relations battle and therefore concentrates on those who are in power, on the elites, and on the establishment. Therefore, the tactics is to avoid a public discussion of these matters, to delay bringing up issues that are sensitive, to make certain issues taboo. BDS was taboo. Today, apartheid is taboo. Talk to me about everything, but don't use that word because it is not helpful. And therefore, they no longer really care what people say and do, even in the churches, as long as they can get the church leadership to delay, prevent, and avoid any action that will be harmful to the policies of the State of Israel. Right now, the policy is to put everybody on the defensive. Anybody who speaks out against Israel risks being called anti-Semitic. There's a new definition of anti-Semitism called the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, where 7 out of the 11 examples given have to do with Zionism and the State of Israel. So that any criticism, any action, any position that is viewed as against Zionism or against the State of Israel is labeled anti-Semitic, and the courts are being used and administrative procedures are being used to threaten and attack those who carry out those activities for justice and for reconciliation and for human rights and for equality as being anti-Semitic and as being examples of hate speech. So now, as my time approaches being ended, the task before us is how can we as a church enter into the fray again? How can we become leaders rather than obstacles or followers of the movement of history? Because I believe God is working in the world and is moving things more towards equality, more towards human rights and human dignity, more towards recognition of the rights of the vulnerable and of the marginalized and of the oppressed. And the church should be the place where that movement finds its power, where we move out of our belief in the values of the kingdom of God in that direction, rather than be so afraid of our own position, of our own reputation, of our own being attacked, that we are an obstacle rather than the vehicle of bringing about the necessary change. And this is not a change that has to be anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, but rather it's a change that is for human rights, human dignity, equality, and against racism, discrimination, and yes, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and any other discrimination on racism. This is all the time that I have now, and I look forward to hear from the rest of the panel, and maybe later we can engage in how that task can be handled.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for these clear and powerful remarks that certainly set the tone for our conversation. The next part of the panel is a response to the question, how has your church or organization engaged in advocacy in Israel-Palestine in recent years? What new or renewed advocacy are you being called to today? What challenges are you facing in your advocacy work for peace with justice in Palestine and Israel? The 5 presenters in this section of the panel, I will introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. First, Archbishop Linda Nichols, Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. Next comes Reverend Bishop Susan Johnson, National Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. Then, Right Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, Moderator of the United Church of Canada, followed by Reverend Dr. Dorcas Gordon, Principal Emerita of Knox College, Presbyterian Church of Canada, followed by Mr. Carl Hetu, Executive Director of the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace and Caritas Canada, and former Director of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association from 2004 to 2022. Please, Reverend Linda Johnson.
Thank you very much. The Anglican Church of Canada has a long commitment to partnership with our Anglican siblings in the Episcopal Province of Jerusalem and the Middle East through national and international programs and networks. Through the direct companion diocese relationship of this Diocese of Ottawa with the Diocese of Jerusalem, and through the local Canadian Companions of the Diocese of Jerusalem formed in 2011. This broad-based and far-reaching relationship for many years provides the foundation for our engagement in advocacy for peace with justice for Palestinians and Israelis. Church members seek to learn and deepen their understanding through informed pilgrimage led by clergy and lay leaders that encounter the living stones, present-day Christians in Palestine and Israel. We have acted for peace in partnership with ecumenical groups and the Diocese of Jerusalem on specific local and larger concerns. And an important part of our efforts is our collaboration in full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and other Canadian denominations and ecumenical organizations. With the ELCIC, we annually celebrate Jerusalem and Holy Land Sunday on the 7th Sunday of Easter, when we specifically pray together for our partners in the Middle East and encourage donations to particular projects such as the recent training of a Palestinian medical student or the needs of children at the Jerusalem Princess Basma Center and the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. Our advocacy has been informed by the Anglican Archbishops of Jerusalem, who have attended our national synods and met with National Government of Canada parliamentarians and others. In addition, successive primates, staff, and others have traveled to our partners for discussion and direction, and our advocacy and action are always undertaken in consultation with those partners. They are further informed by the Collective Council of Patriarchs and Heads of Churches in Jerusalem and of the Anglican Communion. Our actions and advocacy have included visits such as this one to national government ministers, members of parliament, members of the diplomatic service, and other agencies. We have written letters, issued statements, and called with gratitude and concern for Canada's leadership in international efforts towards peace and justice for displaced persons and refugees, children, women, and other marginalized persons in the land. The National Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and I have written together, and with the endorsement of other Canadian church leaders, to the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs on specific situations, including recently in May 2020, to express concern about the then U.S. President's Peace for Prosperity plan, about moving the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, and to thank the Canadian government for confirming in various ways the international status of Jerusalem as a city of two peoples and three faiths. We wrote in May 2021 to protest the conflict between Israel and Gaza and the escalation of violence upon Gazans. And in January 2023, 2 letters concerning the desecration of Mount Zion Christian Cemetery and the East Jerusalem Nev Yaakov settlement synagogue massacre. Our current official policy includes recognition of the legitimate aspirations, rights, and needs of both Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace with dignity within sovereign and secure borders. The condemnation of the use of violence of all kinds, especially against civilians, calls for an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and calls upon Israel as the occupying power to respect the Fourth Geneva Convention, which forbids the transfer and settlement of its own citizens into the occupied territories. We are committed to act together with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and other partners to enable informed awareness and response to the calls of Christian and other faith groups for peace and justice, to educate our own church about the impact of the illegal settlements on the lives of both Palestinians and Israeli, and about imported products identified as produced in or related to the illegal settlements and misleadingly labeled as produced in Israel, and about economic advocacy measures, and to explore and challenge theologies and beliefs such as Christian Zionism, which support the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, to explore and challenge theories and beliefs that deny the right of Israel to exist, and to strengthen relationships with Canadian Jews and Muslims, and to resolutely oppose anti-Semitism, anti-Arab sentiments, and Islamophobia. What are we being called to today? Well, in December 2022, Bishop Susan Johnson and I visited the Holy Land to witness to our full communion relationship with our counterparts in Jerusalem and the West Bank. We were able to visit Gaza, Ramallah, and East Jerusalem to see Anglican and Lutheran medical and educational projects, and we were able to meet with the Canadian representative to the Palestinian Authority, Mr. David De Silva, and hear more about the work of the Canadian government and ongoing concerns in the region. And it was our December visit that galvanized us to come now to Ottawa with other partners to speak to our government about our deep concern about the situation there and our certainly perception of the silence of the Canadian government on issues that we have Canadian policy statements on that have not been acted on. The plight of Palestinian Christians is increasingly precarious. We were repeatedly told that young people see no future in Palestine or Israel for themselves, given the restrictions and uncertainties. The hospitals, which serve the whole community regardless of race or religion, have difficulty finding staff. Palestinians form the majority of health workers, as travel is restricted and unpredictable. And the medical student we assisted, who has now graduated and has become a physician, has a job waiting for him at the Augusta Victoria Hospital in East Jerusalem, but is unable to take it up due to the lack of a permit to travel through Jerusalem to reach the hospital. We visited St. Andrew's Church, Ramallah, where the Israeli Defense Forces in August 2022 broke down the door of the church to reach the offices of the nonprofit human rights organization Al-Haq that rented space from them and which had a clearly marked separate entrance next to the church. prior to this event, church spaces had generally been considered safe and not subject to invasion. More recently, the Church of Gethsemane in East Jerusalem was invaded, and a bishop and 2 priests were attacked during a religious ceremony by 2 radical Israeli settlers. These attacks follow upon the January desecration of Mount Zion Cemetery under the care of the Diocese of Jerusalem, and escalate the many microaggressions experienced by Palestinian Christians and Muslims in Jerusalem and beyond every day. And so we've come to Ottawa to speak yesterday and today to parliamentarians of all parties to urge our government to take a stronger stance on things they have already said are policy of the Canadian government and are consistent with Canadian values. We continue to seek respectful dialogue, friendship, partnership, and peace with our Jewish neighbors in Canada, and we seek to continue to walk with our partners in Palestine and Israel and all who are seeking peace with justice for all, including creation itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Nichols. Bishop Susan Johnson.
Thank you. It's tempting for me just to say ditto because of the full communion relationship, but I'm going to take a different tact instead. I'd like to talk about the importance about relationships and partnerships in the advocacy work that we do. Of course, the relationship that we have as sister bishops in full communion, the full communion relationship between our churches is one that Archbishop Linda has fully demonstrated in what she's been talking about. But there are other relationships I want to speak of. A friendship between 2 members of the Lutheran World Federation Council, one a predecessor of mine as National Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and one the Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, led to a new relationship and partnership relationship between our 2 churches at a signing ceremony in 1999. We've been able to have Bishop Munib Yunan come several times to Canada to speak to both national and synod conventions, to talk about the realities of what is happening on the ground in Palestine and Israel, and to inform us and encourage us in the advocacy we must take and the partnership that their church yearns for. In 2007, when I was elected, I inherited both the church-to-church relationship and the friendship with Bishop Munib Yunan, so I was happy about both things. But I want to spend some time acknowledging other relationships. And I want to tell you these things because I think it's in the relationships, both person to person and institution to institution, that helps us both with our knowledge of the situation on the ground and deepens our commitment to do the work of advocacy here in Canada. So I am part of a group called COCOP, which is International Partners of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. As a result, I'm in the Palestinian territories on an annual basis to meet with partners to hear the realities of what's going on and to come back and report to my church what I'm hearing. I'm a member, or my church is a member of the Lutheran World Federation, which runs Augusta Victoria Hospital in East Jerusalem and a vocational training center in Beit Hanina, East Jerusalem, and one in Ramallah. The LWF Council and the Lutheran World Federation Assembly both regularly make statements and make urgent pleas to governments and international agencies about the realities of what's happening in Israel-Palestine, calling for peace with justice. Our International Development and Relief Agency, Canadian Lutheran World Relief, has partnerships in the area and has organized visits with members of the church to go and explore what's happening with our neighbors in the Holy Land. We're members of the World Council of Churches, who runs the ecumenical advocacy, ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel. And who make statements regularly, including at their assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany this last September, a new statement which did not call the relationship in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, one of apartheid, but did refer to the reports from B'Tselem and Amnesty International, which have done exactly that. A step forward, maybe not far enough. I've already talked about our full relationship with our full communion relationship with the Anglican Church, but we both are members of Kairos and do work in the area of Palestine and Israel with them as well. I was part of the the delegation that went in 2019. And we have taken several church leader tours, my church, to the region, because it's important for me anyhow, to have help in terms of having church leaders to be able to speak out to the constituency and continue to encourage them to do the advocacy work that we need to do in Canada. This new partnership that we have, we're learning more and more that we need to reach out to our sister churches and do actions together. We're learning this in some ways, at least our church is learning this, because we are increasingly smaller and have increasingly fewer resources. And to be able to do what we want to do, we need to do it with partners. And that's calling us to reach out in new ways. Archbishop Linda has already talked about the letters we write. Sometimes we get responses, many times we don't. And we are constantly doing work to educate our constituency. This summer at our joint assembly, our two churches will be looking at a new resolution on peace and justice in Palestine and Israel that has some differences from previous statements. One of the things we commit ourselves to is to finding safe spaces for conversation in Canada, recognizing that this situation in Israel and Palestine tends to be polarizing. It's difficult to get people with differing views into a room to have conversations and to try and figure out a new way forward. So we're making a commitment to try and create those safe spaces where those conversations can happen. We're committing ourselves to address the impacts of Christian Zionism, not just in general, but within our own churches, recognizing that we have a diversity of theological opinions within our churches. Similarly, we're being called to reflect on the parallels between the occupation in Palestine and the broken treaties and the occupation of unceded territories here in Canada. Every time we go to visit in Palestine, our partners tell us, look at your own house first. What are you doing in terms of the occupation of Indigenous lands in Canada? We've committed ourselves to address anti-Semitism, again, not just in general, but within our own churches, because we recognize that we also have a history that we need to call out, and we need to learn new ways of talking and new ways of behavior. There is no mention in our new policy of a two-state solution, although we do call for an end of the occupation. And it leaves us with a really important question, namely, what is the future for a peaceful solution in Israel and Palestine if it's not going to be a two-state solution? I don't have an answer to that. I know there are many people in the region and around the world wanting to have that conversation, but at times it feels hopeless. We also have concerns about a call from MPs who went to the region in 2018 for a special envoy for the rights of the child in the region of Palestine, for Palestinian children in particular, but I know that my friend Dorcas is going to be talking about that later on, and that's good that we're sort of dividing up the responsibilities. I think I often wish that we had more resources to do what the churches in Palestine want us to do. It's hard to listen to our opening speaker talk about the disappointment in the church and in church leaders, but we own that. So I think what we're discovering is that it is through partnerships and looking for new partnerships, not just among churches, but among faith groups and with civil society, that we can do more to make a difference here in Canada and in Palestine and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Johnson. moderator Carmen Lansdowne.
Thank you. When I was first ordained, I had the opportunity to serve on the governing bodies of the World Council of Churches, which Bishop Susan mentioned. And all four of our denominations are member churches of the World Council of Churches. And I mention this because early in my 7-year term, the nominations committee was presenting a slate of potential names for people, and they were looking for an Indigenous person to serve on the Environmental Justice Committee. And as one of 4 Indigenous people on the 200-person governing body of the WCC, I stood up and said, you know, why is it that Indigenous people are only asked to serve on environmental stewardship? What if we have something to say about nuclear disarmament? What if we have something to say about poverty reduction? What if we have something to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And so I left that plenary hall, and somebody came up to me and said, speaking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I thus began a term as co-chair of the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum Core Group of the World Council of Churches, which was my first introduction really in depth to the situation on the ground in Palestine and Israel. My mother was a member of the program to combat racism of the World Council of Churches, which was the church, the WCC advocacy committee that really spearheaded and started the global anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. And I remember traveling to a meeting that her committee was having in Seattle, and that was my first time being aware of that Palestinians were Indigenous like me. And there was a man named Anwar Barkat who served on that committee with her. And I also mentioned the WCC because along with the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Peace in Palestine and Israel, which many of our churches have sent observers to go and spend a significant amount of time, a 3-month minimum, in living in the occupied Palestinian territories to witness life for regular Palestinians. The WCC also supports and is engaged with the Middle East Council of Churches and coordinates this Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum core group of staff from member churches who are doing the work every day in partnership with our Palestinian partners. The WCC held an international consultation in Amman, Jordan in 2007, in June of 2007, and issued the Amman Call calling for a just peace in the Middle East, which resulted in a 2007 consultation in Bern, Switzerland, on the issue of Christian Zionism, and also in the generation of the Kairos Palestine Call to our member churches. We also worked on a resource for congregational study, which didn't really go anywhere, to my disappointment. We tried to convert the very academic papers from the Bern Conference into a congregational study, and just our backgrounds and the places where our churches are operating, the contexts were culturally and linguistically too disparate to be able to try and create one resource out of the WCC. I also want to acknowledge and own our friend Jonathan's deep pain at the disappointing results that come from especially our general councils, general synods, and to speak to the conciliar nature, especially of the United Church of Canada, and I think it's probably very similar in the Presbyterian Church from where we got our original structure, in that we are in some ways we make decisions at the national level, but most of the work of the United Church of Canada happens at the congregational level and now at the regional level. And so we are not of one mind about how to advocate nationally when it comes to our national policies on Palestine and Israel. And that has been deeply painful for people across all spectrums of positions, and especially for those who have witnessed life on the ground in the West Bank, some in Gaza, and who continue to have a very deep and lasting commitment of solidarity to our Palestinian partners. And so what is sometimes hard about the fact that we cannot or have not yet come to a consensus or even a majority vote on issues that are being called upon where the United Church is being called upon by our Palestinian partners is that we also have some freedom where we have networks within the United Church of Canada and within ecumenical networks in Canada that United Church members are deeply, deeply committed to and participate faithfully in, and I want to acknowledge that too. And so even though sometimes it can look like Carmen, the moderator of the United Church of Canada, is constrained by the office of the moderator in that what I speak to is our policies that are on the books. There are many, many, many Canadian members of the United Church of Canada who are doing local and regional and federal advocacy on behalf of our Palestinian partners outside of those national policies. We have a team in our church and mission unit who work with formal and informal partners in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Israel. We have many, many, many advocacy groups from across the country that do come and see visits. And since the Kairos document was first issued from Kairos Palestine, we encourage all of those come and see visits to follow the guidelines that are set out and to engage in their visits to the Holy Land in a way that is consistent with our calls from Palestinian partners. And then we also have informal networks, and I'll mention one which is NJEPI, which is the United Network for a Just Peace in Palestine and Israel, which are probably our most strident United Church voices speaking truth to power about the occupation. It's a network of mostly United Church people, but people of other faiths and people of no faiths who are committed to supporting a just and lasting peace in Palestine and Israel. And so while they are not a formal part of the United Church of Canada, many of the people that are members of the United Church of Canada are involved with NJEPI and continue to be able to act in ways that are pushing the boundaries of where we have been able to go so far as a national denomination. And then our staff also coordinate the Canadian United Church and sometimes other denominations' participation in the EAPI program through the WCC. We also have at the governance level our Theology, Interchurch, and Interfaith Committee, which is the theological committee that writes theological statements about our interchurch relations and our interfaith relations and about justice issues. They are currently working on proposals that were deferred from our last general council, or we asked them to go back and do more work around a principles-based approach to our justice work in general, a principles-based approach to our work, to our justice work for peace in Palestine and Israel, as well as an additional piece of work that was assigned to them from last summer's general council, which is to define what we mean when we talk about anti-Semitism. The United Church's current policy is we've signed on to an open letter opposing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and we've been challenged by some Jewish voices in Canada to define, okay, if you're against or if you oppose the IHRA definition, then how do you define anti-Semitism? And so they're also currently working on that with an acknowledgement and a deep pain for the fact that there's such a huge rise of anti-Semitism in Canada and globally recently. So those are important parts of the work that we are doing currently. I think that for me as an Indigenous woman, I need to acknowledge outside of the office of the moderator that there is a direct link with Canada and the history of apartheid. The apartheid system was based on the Canadian Indian Act. It was a gift from the RCMP after the Boer Wars about how to manage the people that made up the majority of people in Southern Africa. And I think there is a lot of merit to our Israeli and Palestinian partners who say to us, you know, you have to also deal with the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And what I can tell you from my perspective as an Indigenous theologian is that it doesn't have to be an either-or conversation. It can be a both-and conversation. One is not a precondition to the other. That I've learned so much from Palestinian liberation theologians that has impacted my work as an Indigenous liberation theologian here in Canada. And so I'll just acknowledge that that is a really deep personal connection for me. So I will turn it over to Dorcas to talk about the last part.
Signal, did you?
I did. I should not quit sitting quite far enough in the center.
Now I know where to look. You probably realize that in the way we were introduced tonight, that I am not a moderator, I am not a bishop, and I'm not a primate. And so I feel that maybe I can come in from a slightly different direction. I do represent the Presbyterian Church here tonight, but I'm not the moderator. So in preparation for tonight, I reviewed the numerous statements, recommendations, appeals to congregations for action, and letters to the government requesting action on various issues on Palestine-Israel, approved by our General Assembly from 1967 to the present. The number of letters that various moderators sent to prime ministers of the day, particularly the recent past and the present prime minister, were too numerous to count. And the results have certainly been less than significant. So what I'd like to do is perhaps, I don't want to go back over the past, but I'd like to just maybe take a slightly different tact. And Jonathan really did this. I mean, I could say ditto to what Jonathan said. Really, the question is, what developments in Palestine-Israel can we say are new? There's little that's new about more settlements, about a proposed annexation of the West Bank, an increasing number of home demolitions, displaced Palestinian villages and communities, or administrative detention of adult and child prisoners. But what we can say, and what many claim as new, and Jonathan did, is the clarity with which this government in Israel expresses its intention vis-a-vis Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim. I had a bunch of things that I could point out, but Jonathan, I think, said them all so eloquently. So although most of the developments are not new, what we do know is that there are increasingly deadly consequences for Palestinians should move the churches, which claim to be committed to justice, to reassess their policies and practices for advocacy. It is an opportune moment for us to do this. So for the rest of my time, I want to speak to what I see as the advocacy role of the churches, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, in the political sphere, and as requested by our Palestinian partners. My contention is that the churches, in my case, specifically the Presbyterian, must become socially and politically more active, forming deeper alliances across denominations and with others, groups that are Jewish and Muslim, those of no professed religion, in the forum of public opinion, demanding that the federal government and the mainstream Canadian media speak more clearly and honestly without misdirection in defense of international law and human rights that Canada claims for all equally. In the recent past, January 20th of this year, the government laid out its values, what its policy is on Israel-Palestine. It said it all. It's got it there, but it doesn't do anything with it. What we need to ask is the government to demonstrate why they believe a two-state solution is possible, and if the evidence suggests it's not, be transparent with us about what that means for government politics, policy, and action going forward. My comments in no way discount the generous donations that the Government of Canada and the churches provide for the humanitarian and development needs of Palestinians. We know that money for medicine and food, the rebuilding of destroyed hospitals and schools, and to UNRWA for humanitarian assistance and protection for Palestinian refugees, pending a just and lasting solution in this disputed land. But such relief cannot be seen as a viable solution to a violent occupation or the imbalance of power that continues to exist in Israel-Palestine, especially when one considers the other forms of support, financial and moral, that Canada, and more particularly the US, gives regularly to Israel. My conclusion is that the churches must speak out more within Canadian political life in a way that I think will be very uncomfortable for many. Many years ago, I served as a congregational minister in an area where there was a great deal of need, and the congregation responded generously. However, I still remember the day I asked the leadership to consider why, in a city as rich as Toronto, people had to rely on food banks. I challenged them to consider what in our political, economic, or social systems might need to change to alleviate the problem. I was immediately shut down. Since that event, I have continued to struggle with how the church should view the relationship between the political and the theological, and what it means if the churches don't add their voice in the public sphere to what makes for life-giving and life-destroying choices. So what are some of the examples of social and political action? This is where I'm going to talk about a special envoy for Palestinian children, pressuring the government to appoint such an envoy to investigate the deadly effects of military law on Palestinian children. We all know the situation. Palestinian children are being targeted and shot by the Israeli military and settlers, 19 so far this year, or imprisoned in a unjust military court structure where the age of majority is 12. A system that sends heavily armed soldiers in the middle of the night to arrest them, interrogating them, often subjecting them to physical and/or moral coercion. A court system which doesn't recognize the rights of the parents to be with their child and can suspend access to a lawyer for up to 90 days for security reasons. As a signatory to this convention, surely our government must commit to valuing and promoting respect for the rights of all children within Canada and challenging others like Israel who signed the convention to live up to the principles enshrined in it. A second example, I didn't get the 2 minute yet, did I? Oh, I did. I gotta talk faster. A second thing then would be
I'll give you my 2 minutes.
champion the call that went out recently by Canadian human rights organizations and advocates to request the federal government to study reports of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others to evaluate their allegations of apartheid in the West Bank and Israel, and to share with us that evaluation, where they agree, where they disagree, and if they, and the thing is not to call Israel an apartheid state, but to get our government to engage in a discussion, an open discussion, and to get the media to be part of that so we as Canadians can be informed. It's a conversation that's long overdue in which the churches could and should play a part. My time is limited, so I am going to turn to what the Palestinian Christians are asking us to do. You heard it from Jonathan. The Kairos document, 2009, come and see and go and tell. As part of this, the Presbyterian Church's response was to have study tours, which my husband and I led for a number of years, to see the situation on the ground, and then to come back and tell. Our last study tour in 2019, what we saw after almost a decade of leading such tours was an ever-worsening situation. When the Presbyterian Church in Canada agreed or adopted the Kairos document, it pledged to be in costly solidarity with the Palestinian Christians. My concern is what that word costly is going to mean for us going forward. Our Palestinian sisters and brothers have asked us to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, a non-violent tool of resistance. My own denomination has limited that to participating in boycotting settlement products. From the information I have, and I stand to be corrected, only the Mennonite Church Canada has accepted BDS fully. And the United Church in Canada has accepted to divest from companies complicit in the occupation. Palestinian Christians have asked us to challenge Christian Zionism. Time is up. 2011, the Presbyterian Church adopted a statement rejecting Christian Zionism. But have we tackled it more directly within our communities and outside and inside our church communities? So here's my conclusion. Let me say I believe the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and more personally, I fell short in responding to the Kairos document. Only a few of us went to sea, and many of us were less than comfortable when we returned in speaking boldly about what we saw. We fell short again in 2017 when the National Coalition of Christian Organizations in Palestine asked for our costly solidarity. I believe now is a Kairos moment for the Canadian churches. My church, Palestine, Israel, is a test case for us. How committed are we to a just and peaceful world? How committed are we to pay the price of costly solidarity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's not an easy topic to tackle, the Israel-Palestine issue. Over the last 20 years, I've been to that part of the world at least 15 times. I've met many Israeli people, groups, rabbi, associations, normal families. They invited me to the Sabbat. I had lunch and supper with many Israeli people. And many of them told me how afraid they were. They were afraid. And that's not in the last 3 years, that's in the last 15 years. They're afraid, they live in fear. And then I met a lot of the Palestinians. I met everybody that could be met. And they told me the same thing. So here we are, two groups of people that are living in fear. And looks like they're in a deadlock. And they've been since 1947. And some would say, actually it started with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Great Britain agreed that it would be great to have the Jewish people of Europe to go back in their land. And it would solve their problem in Great Britain and Europe. And since then, there's been this problematic. Something I've learned over the years is that no matter what you do, no matter what victory you get, it's short-lived, because Israel will make you pay, and will make you pay in their own way, legal way, military way, boycott way, stopping you from traveling to places. And I'll give you a few examples. Myself, I'm from the Catholic Church, of course. Development and Peace is an organization, the official organization of the Bishops' Conference of Canada. And before that, I was with Catholic Near East Welfare Association that works since 1926 in the Holy Land. And I can tell you that each time a Pope visited the Holy Land, Israel responded swiftly right after. When Pope Paul VI visited the Holy Land in 1964, he gave, with that visit, a new life to the Christian churches over there, Catholic, with many institutions that were built at that time. And also he brought a lot of interest from Catholic communities all over the world, and money came in. And that built institutions, amazing institutions. And you know, up to not long ago, all the Catholic and Christian, not just Catholic, Christian institution would represent 45% of all the social services provided to Palestinians, even though today they represent only 1%. 50,000 Christians living in the West Bank right now. But because many left and some religious communities don't get their permits to stay, now it's down to 35% or so. But what's interesting is when Pope Paul VI left and gave this great enthusiasm to the Palestinian people, and particularly the Christians, then you had the 7-Day War 3 years later, and Israel took control of the whole land. So Palestine was suddenly occupied illegally since 1967. Jordan was pushed out. And so people had to learn to live with a new occupier. And things started not to go too well as we thought with the church. Then when Pope John Paul II went in 2000, in the same year he went, an intifada started. Because, as you know, the Oslo Accord a few years before, where it was the first time in the history that Palestine recognized Israel. And it was the first time that Israel recognized Palestinian. Before that, they called them the Arabs, not Palestinians. So the Oslo Accord, there was that first time of mutual recognition. But as you know, history turned out that there was a killing, and things did not go too far. And hell broke loose, and we got an intifada. Pope Francis went in 2014. He was told by the Israel government, your predecessors that came, follow the path. We want you to follow the same path. You will go there, you'll go here, you'll do as we want. And the Pope refused. He says, nobody's going to tell me what I'm going to do when I travel. Pretty bold, maybe a bit naive, maybe bold. Remember this moment when he drove and he stopped before Bethlehem on the wall and he prayed? That was not made up. He just came by and says, I need to pray before I go and speak to the people of Bethlehem. Well, the price of that is, as you know, the Pope invited, not the price, but the Pope invited all the church leaders and also government leaders to come and pray with him in Rome. So in June, that trip was in May 2014. In May, that was the trip. In June, they all went and prayed. Do you remember that? It was an amazing moment, a moment of grace. Then in June, is it June or July? In July, then the war broke in Gaza, were 51 days of bombarding by the Israeli army on Gaza. 51 days. And at night, they wouldn't send bombs. They would send explosive that would explode in the air so people wouldn't sleep at night. And so, yes, the church accompanied the people. We sent a lot of money to help the church and the groups to deal with the psycho-trauma of the people in there. But what I'm trying to tell you is despite all of those things, we need to lobby. We need to get together. And one example where, again, we thought we had a victory is, do you know the Crimson Valley? Anybody, if you have visited the Crimson Valley? Yeah, you know the story of the Crimson Valley? So in 2015, after 6-7 years of legal battles run by the St. Yves Society, which is the Latin Patriarchate law firm that helps Christians and non-Christian Palestinians in general that get order of eviction. The idea was to save this valley, some 55 families that owned the land since the time of the Ottoman Empire. But the problem is there's 2 illegal settlements, Gilo and El Gilo, and between the beautiful valley of Crimson. Well, I participated with the Holy Land Coordination. Since the year 2000, Pope John Paul II invited the Catholic church leaders from all the West, so from England, from Ireland, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, United States, Canada, to visit every year, to do a pilgrimage every January. And the Canadian bishop, as represented, always sent a bishop to that. And at the end, after the conclusion of a visit of usually 5 days, they will bring a statement, strong statement, sometimes maybe not as strong as we would like, but a strong statement. For the Crimson Valley, it was decided that maybe we could win this one. And so there was a strong statement on that. And I remember we even met. I participated at a meeting with the Israeli ambassador to Canada, with the bishop's president at the time, Paul-André Durocher. And the ambassador says, look, it's in the hands of the court. You cannot make this political. It's in the hands of the court. Let the court do its work. You know how that works in Canada, same in Israel. We said, well, we're not too sure about that. But nevertheless, each Episcopal assembly, and even the one from South Africa that joined that meeting after a while, wrote a letter to their foreign minister to intervene with the Israeli counterpart. And also the letter was sent to each ambassador in each of the country. Next thing we know, it goes in court a few months later. Big victory. The courts tells the army, you will leave part of the Crimson alone because there's Christians living there, there's a Catholic school, there's a winery, leave them there. But then 6 months later, the same court changed its mind and says, no, the army know best. Let them decide. So if you go over there now, there's a big wall. And the people that own the land need to knock on the door and ask permission to go there. Of course, there's not a door yet. I haven't been there in 2 years, but I don't think there's a door yet. But to go to the school of the Salesian sisters, there's not supposed to be a wall there yet, but all the structure are ready. So what I'm saying to you is, why was this change done? I mean, what a big difference does it make for Palestine? There's no even Palestinians living there. It's just land with a school. They could have let go. So the idea is, it happened that same summer, the Vatican signed an agreement with the Palestinian Authority in how they would use the holy sites. A friendly, legal contract. And they were about to sign one with Israel as well. But at the insistence of the Holy Father, he said this is going to be a state-to-state agreement. Not a state to a Palestinian territory, state to state. So the speculation, I cannot accuse because I will be accused by all those nice people looking at us that are just looking for us to do mistakes, that basically it is an hypothesis, strong hypothesis, that because the Vatican insisted in using the word Palestinian state, that they turned them off so badly that the court reversed its case. That's just a speculation. The other reason is that we think that is suddenly Israel did not want to sign their state-to-state agreement in the use of holy sites in Israel. Worse, they included a new clause that all Catholic institutions, if this is signed, will have to pay taxes owed since 1967. Can you believe millions of dollars? And you know what happened not long ago when the mayor of Jerusalem says, it's about time all the church in my city will pay a tax from now on. And all the churches got together, they shut down the Holy Sepulchre for the first time, I think, in 100 years. And finally, the prime minister at the time said, it's the same guy, right? It's the same guy that's back. and he said, he told the mayor, calm down. We'll create a commission to study this, and let's see what happens. So I'm finished, really. There's so much we can say, but my conclusion, and of course what Jonathan is saying, it's not easy to make a big difference when we lobby, but one thing is clear, if we do nothing, then nothing will ever happen. And each time we raise, each time we speak, each time we write a communique, each time we meet an MP, each time we do something, there's more and more people knowing about it. If you go to the Holy Land, you bring your friends. I've done that 7 trips in a row, and when people go there on a pilgrimage, they come back, says, my God, I've learned something here about today's Christians and what they're enduring. So yeah, and let's be frank, Palestinian society is not perfect either, right? They are having a hard time to get along with one another, but that's not an excuse. There's an injustice taking place. And when there's an injustice from our faith base, we need to do something. And Pope Francis is showing us the lead. I think the bishops of Canada more and more are aware of this issue and are willing to act on it. And so I think through this Holy Land Coordination is a nice way to act. And through Development in Peace and Kenewa and many other organizations that are sending a lot of funds over there so that people can continue to serve and to fight and for what is right. So yeah. So despite all of these things, we absolutely need to speak out, more so than ever and together. So that's why this table today is a good example. And it would be best maybe next time if we add Muslims here. You know, and there are some Jewish people here in Ottawa that have a clear voice about this, and maybe we can go further. There are more and more Jewish in Canada that are quite offended of what's going on in Israel, and Israel that's now going into what we call the templehood. Templehood. They want to take the temple. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you all for these insightful, powerful, and frankly prophetic remarks. We'll see where we, how can we build on this with some more clarity for action. The third part of the panel is a response, first from Ms. Jane Thirikwa, Global Partnerships Coordinator for Kairos, Canada. Kairos, for most of you know, but for those who don't, unites Canadian churches and religious organizations in a faithful ecumenical response to the call to justice. Then will be followed by one of our own, Dr. Michael Séguin, who is professor at the Providence School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. We asked Jane and Michael to respond to two questions. To Jane, from your perspective in NGO leadership, what do you believe can and should be the role of the churches in advocacy? And for Michael, from your perspective as a scholar with expertise in this area, what do you believe can and should be the role of the churches in advocacy? Thank you. Jane.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'll try to respond to 5 panelists in 10 minutes. And it's also really cold in here. I'm kind of freezing. Well, from a human rights, social justice perspective, the formal acknowledgement of the fundamental basis of human rights is based in international organized advocacy that originates in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at the very core of this conversation, we are talking about the context of occupation and Israel's continuing oppressive and discriminatory system of governance and of governing Palestinians in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in its very nature and injustice. There are, of course, theological and ecumenical linkages to human rights in the declaration that teach us about protesting their violation, advocating for the international codification, and supporting effective ways to monitor and ensure compliance with the declarations. As is often the case, the perpetrators of human rights abuses in Palestine claim that we have no credibility or that violations are internal state affairs. And whilst the declarations might not legally be a basis to bring legislative and policy change in Palestine, they are essential to civil society struggles. For instance, with the women we work with and the partners in Palestine, they are using the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, as a platform to make strategic gains in changing discriminatory policy and law in Palestine, but to also lean on international allies and support against the system of the Israeli occupation and oppression. Like many institutions and the churches, they work on a rights-based approach in their mandate. In many cases, faith-based organizations have a natural tendency to take the rights-based approach because of the long-term relationships, sometimes less political agendas on pressure than state-funded agencies, which is not always the case, as history, Kairos has a history of targeting, of being targeted as being anti-Semitism in the past. So the church, like Kairos and NGOs, are more deliberate in taking lead from Palestinians and human rights organizations and partners in a model that is more of an accompaniment, and it guides the collaborative solidarity with the goal of not only strengthening the local church, but also emphasizing and creating inclusive advocacy and human rights strategies as well. And while we acknowledge the sensitivities of this conflict and the debate about advocacy language and definition of oppressive systems, the answer is always right in front of us from the Palestinian peoples who are living these experiences, who share with us their stories, their reports, their data every day. And Mr. Kutab gave a clear overview of this. So Dorcas talked about the media and how much Canadians know about these cases. And we hear this from our Palestinian partners every day. So what are the Christian partners and Palestinians telling us about the role of the church and the international community? Reverend Linda talked about the attacks on the Christian churches. And I was looking at the reports from our partners, and they were telling us that there have been 7 such incidences this year, up to March so far. But how many Canadians know about these cases? The systemic attacks on Christian churches, on the personnel and the harassment, the imposition of taxes on many churches and Christian establishments, like Carl was talking about. In a statement from the heads of churches in Jerusalem in 2021, they stated that there are countless instances of physical and verbal abuse against priests and other clergy, attacks on Christian churches, with the holy sites regularly vandalized and desecrated, and ongoing intimidation of local Christians who simply seek to worship freely and go about their daily lives. We saw the reports coming from the Easter month just a few weeks ago. So Canadians, either through the media and selective sources of information, are mostly unaware of these incidences. It is therefore important that the church recognizes its position or lack of position in the Palestine-Israel conflict. There are references even from the holy books about being silent in times of affliction, in times of oppression and marginalization. But as is the case, this only serves the status quo and power imbalance. That the church, in its pillars of accountability and compassion, put in the work to internally and disrupt the ideologies of binary of choice, like we call it in the NGO world. So because both religious and political extremism is also on the rise, theological distortions of faith is resulting to misreadings and causing deep religious divisions and contributing to conflict escalation. Our task as NGOs, as Christians, as a church, is to participate in dismantling it, developing a culture of critical and self-critical thinking, and cultivating an atmosphere of acceptance and pluralism. And not to get caught in the conversations about the two-state solution like Kutab was talking about. The partners are telling us that indeed we are skipping a step. When you're taking this road, talking about the two-state solution, that there cannot be any solutions moving forward because unless we denounce and call for the end of the occupation and call out the multitude of injustices and oppression and power, such as the power exerted by the Israeli government on the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people through taxation, and recognizing that even the Palestinian Authority representatives and Palestinians themselves cannot even come to the table on equal footing while there is still occupation. So that the church should not shy away from engaging in the difficult conversations regarding even the Canada's relationship with the Holocaust. If you're talking about an example of looking back at the turning back of the ships with refugees at sea during the Holocaust. So this is an example, for instance, that addresses these challenges and topics that can serve to strengthen Judeo-Christian relationships and dialogues through being able to speak truths based on the fundamentals of human dignity that every human has an innate right to be able to live a dignified life marked by agency. So the task really for faith-based organizations and churches is that they can play a role in human rights where the state of civil society is weak because of the position of the church. They inspire movements and building citizen advocacy. And if you look at even like the faith language and human rights-based advocacy, it offers a richness that complements mainstream human rights approaches. And with the belief that we are all made in the image of God, this adds to the framework of human rights that emphasizes the concepts of collective common good. And with members all over the church, a long tradition of storytelling and preaching and the rich imagery of the Bible, churches have distinct advantages to make injustice real to the constituents everywhere. I was thinking about some mentions about financial and humanitarian support to the Palestinian people. And through like some of the partners that we work with, they're offering psychosocial support and trauma coping. In the NGO world, we talk about trauma healing, but how can there be healing for our people who are still living under the oppressive system of oppression and occupation? If you're offering prayer and love and hope to generations of Palestinians who are born in occupation, they live in occupation, and sadly lose their lives fighting this occupation, that is the human face of what the occupation is for Palestinians. So the task really is for us to do more. The Palestinians and the Palestinian partners are asking for us to do more. And it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we cannot bring about change if you're not willing to step up and to talk about those difficult conversations. Even as we internally take stock and do self-auditing even amongst our own churches and our own denominations. The relationships between the global south and the global north, the Presbyterian church, for example, with their policies, it's just an example of the policies that they have adopted in the global north, but a whole contrast with the policies in global south as well. So how can we bring even our churches together to have a united voice when you're talking about human rights and framing our work on a human rights basis? Thank you so much. My time is up. Over to the next panelist. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking maybe from a more easy position, you know, the academia, the ivory tower. I'm not a church leader. I don't have to deal with members who don't agree with the policies. I mean, sometimes my students are complaining, but I'm not dealing with thousands of people. I'm in a school of leadership, so I try to be involved in leadership training. I think I understand some of the challenges you're facing, and it's not easy, really. I want to start there. It's not easy for churches. It's not easy for leaders. And being stuck between the cruel reality that Palestinians are dealing with and the reality of churches that are not growing with less resources, it's a real challenge. So what is it possible to do from there? I have a few points I wrote, so I'm supposed to react to what you said, but I have my notes, so it's kind of prefabricated reactions, but I'll try to make some links. I'm honest. One thing that I've been hearing tonight, and I won't make your life easier with this one. You were all referring to occupation. I think we need conceptual clarity. Okay, I know, from a scholar again, it's classical, but what are we talking about? And I think we've been stuck too long with what's happening in Israel-Palestine with the ethnic conflict paradigm. And what we are talking about is settler colonialism. And I think that the more our parishioners, the more our congregants understand that what is happening out there, far, far away, and what has been happening and is still happening in Canada, that's the same story. It's just that in Israel and Palestine, it started roughly 130 years ago. In Canada, it started 400 years ago. But It's the same process. It's this process of erasing a population and replacing it with another. Of course, there were Jews living in the Holy Land before, and Jews do have a significant relationship to the Holy Land. I'm not denying that. But Zionism the political Zionism is a European project. And the goal was to transfer the Palestinians, to erase them from the map. That's why there was an ethnic cleansing in 1948. This continued in 1967. And some ministers and right-wing settlers in Israel are still calling for this same ethnic cleansing. So there's a real emergency about that. And it's not conceptual debate so much as, well, what we're facing is the prospect of a genocide. There has been a genocide, started a long time ago, different strategies, but it can get bad quite swiftly again. So it's really a matter of human dignity, and this is not happening only in the occupied territory. This whole project of Jewish supremacy is something that is happening in the whole of Israel. And I'm not saying that Israel is an illegitimate state. I'm saying that for Israel to have a future and for Palestinians to have a future, we need to talk about decolonization. And so often we get stuck in the vocabulary of peace, which may sound a bit abstract. There was a peace process, didn't work out, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, to have a future for everyone in this country, we need to talk about decolonization and a step further down the road, indigenization and reconciliation. This conversation is starting today in Israel. Some groups like Zohot are talking about that and are trying to raise the awareness of other groups. They are at the margin of the Israeli society, but it's there. Breaking the silence is getting there. New Profile has been in this business for a few years, and there are people in Israel, Israeli Jews, who are talking about that this system of supremacy, of settler colonialism, of apartheid cannot go on. And I'm sure that it's the best solution, it's the best way to get a lot of criticism and to say that, well, it doesn't make sense, you want to erase the state of Israel, etc., etc. But if we want for the people of the Holy Land to live in peace, we need to understand what is going on, and we need some clarity about this. And I think that to talk about settler colonialism, to compare what's happening there with what has been happening and is still happening in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, is very important, because then we can grasp that this process, if we don't do something, will only get worse. That was kind of my first point. The second thing is that you are doing that, and it's something very important to always distinguish between Jews and Judaism. And so, I mean, my first point is not to say that you need to write letters to MP. It's about education. And your churches, and I was very impressed to see how much I knew about what the United Church did, because I was an ecumenical accompanier, so I've been following what was going on in the United Church. But I'm really impressed to see what has been going on in other churches in terms of education, community, and that part is really important, to get our people and our congregations to understand a bit more what is happening and to untangle Judaism and Jews across the world and Zionism. And this is a big challenge. We need to remain very critical of what Israel is doing, but to criticize Israel as we would criticize any country, as we would criticize our own country, as we would criticize our neighbors, we would criticize Russia. We're not criticizing Israel because Israel is a Jewish state or wants to be a Jewish state, but because what's happening is a sin. And I'm just quoting here the Israel-Palestine document. This structure of oppression is a sin. Again, Christian is a sin. Again, Jews is a sin. Again, Muslim is a sin. Again, all the people in the region. And so it's important to do that, but to keep being critical. I'll come back later to the anti-Semitism point. One last point of education that we can do, I think that is very important too, is to be very mindful how easily the Bible can be instrumentalized and is being instrumentalized actually. And it's about addressing Christian Zionism, but a kind of a more subtle way to do that is just to be mindful when we talk about all those places, the Hebrew people, the Galilee, that to make links in our congregation between what was happening there, Jesus walking to the path of Emmaus, and what's happening right now, and that this is a land of, at least for faith, if we add the Baha'i in the portrait, and that behind every major city, there is a Christian tradition, a Jewish tradition, a Muslim tradition. Getting tougher into action. I get it that it was difficult for church to get fully on board with the BDS movement. That in dialogue with Jewish partners, it's not easy to talk about settlement boycott, even though settlement boycott is just the starting point, and we should be talking about boycotting all of goods coming from the state of Israel because of this emergency I was referring to at the start. But I think it's worth still exploring what is possible to do, and to explore what is possible with divestment and what is possible with sanctions. Two last points that I'd like to do. The first one is it's very important to keep the dialogue with Jewish communities because, as you said, Cal, it's true that fear is a big component in all that. And it's difficult to say, I mean, we need tough love in all of it to be able to say that what is happening there is wrong, but at the same time, what we did as Christian in the past was wrong. We are in a very contradictory position as Christians in all of it. Being so involved in the history of anti-Semitism and the suffering of the Jewish people, and at the same time being in a position today to say what you're doing with your state is just fucked up. But at the same time, it can be also speaking, we cannot patronize, we cannot tell them what to say, what to do, but at the same time, it's not only killing Palestinians, I think it's killing Israelis. What is happening is bad for everyone. This need to go to war generation after generation, to do your military service, those 3 years you spend on the front. All the trauma that Israelis are experiencing, not only the intergenerational trauma of the Holocaust, but the trauma of being the one being at a checkpoint and controlling other people. And there needs to be a stop to that situation. And I think that's one of the reasons why dialogue is so important. Realistically, I don't think we will solve the situation only by dialogue. We need this tough love of nonviolent action measures, but we need to keep those doors open and to explain why we're doing that, why we feel that what is happening actually is wrong for all parties. And my last point, again, is this real need to go back. You mentioned those, it was all mentioned, human rights and international law, and we can go back also to some to basic principles like self-determination and self-definition. And that's what the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine, Francesca Albanese, is doing in one of the reports that she wrote lately, to advocate for the right for self-determination and self-definition of all people, including the Palestinian people. So indigenous people do have a right for self-determination, self-definition, relationship from government to government within Canada. And basically, we're advocating for the same for Palestinians. What we're asking is very basic equality, but in a system of supremacy, equality is the opposite of what the most extremist folks want in Israel. And it's very important to do that, and to do that with our partner, but to see keeping in the loop organizations in Israel that are doing that and organizations in Canada that are doing that. And I think that one thing that we need maybe to get stronger on the longer run is to get involved with secular organizations that are doing that too. Be it the Ottawa Forum on Israel and Palestine, the Canadian for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. There are various organizations who have been involved in that business over the years, and I think we need to build strong coalitions. And if we want to get into the advocacy lobby, one MP was saying, I did a few visits with CJPME on the Hill, and one MP was telling us, you know, CJAB, the Center for Jewish and Israeli Affairs, they are in my door every day, but I see you once a year. So if we want to get into that lobbying business more seriously, we need to build larger and stronger coalitions. said the scholar who is doing a visit a year on Parliament Hill.
Thank you all so much for, I feel like I really learned a lot tonight. I am close to the situation, both personally as a Lebanese myself who grew up at the Palestinian-Israeli border, and as someone who thought the question, but I feel inspired and really learned a lot to keep the struggle. I would like to ask if Jonathan can be back on the screen, and with all honesty to all our participants, I think you answered most of the 50 questions or more. And so I don't feel guilty to not represent the questions because you will be repeating some of what you said. So I'd like to ask Jonathan to speak for a couple minutes in response. Do you have a question to the panel that hasn't been addressed? Where do you think is the crust of what's happening? What would you like more clarity on? What do you ask of the panel at this point?
Yes, I have one particular point, which may be actually the central point, maybe even the elephant in the room. One of the reasons why the Canadian church and church leadership has been disappointing to the Palestinians is because they are constantly under threat of pushback, attack, and pressure from Zionist groups in Canada, who themselves are experiencing right now a kind of crisis that we see reflected in Israel every week with these massive demonstrations about people who themselves are, as you said, afraid, or who themselves are questioning some of the principles on which the whole state was created, who themselves are seeking to have a constitution, who themselves talk about the need for controlling the overpowering oppression of the numerical majority. In a way, maybe the Christian church in Canada, certainly in the United States, feels that their past sins of anti-Jewishness, their failure to come to the support of Jews in their need, somehow makes them in a continuously defensive position. So that when Israelis do things, and when Israelis are in a crisis, and they feel the need to speak out of their conscience, they are quickly quieted down because the Zionists are telling you, if you love Jews, if you are truly repentant of your anti-Semitism, you will not be criticizing the state of Israel. You will not be talking about apartheid. You will not be insensitive to our security needs, whatever we determine them to be. And in a way, if you really love the Jewish people, if you really repent from past sins against Jews, I think you need to take a strong position on Zionism, because Zionists do not represent, at least certainly the kind of Zionism we see in Israel today, does not represent the best interest of the Jewish people or of Judaism. And when you submit to that kind of bullying pressure, you are really not doing Jewish Israelis any favor. You are, in fact, perpetuating a system and an ideology that ultimately hurts them as well. The answer, I think, is in the other fallacy, or is in the other problem. And it is particularly one felt by church leadership. We are tempted to think that we can solve the problem. or that we need to solve the problem, or that we need to have a solution to the forces that are in conflict in Israel-Palestine. Maybe that is the wrong way to look at it. Maybe what you need to ask yourself is not what is the solution, but what is it that we believe in? What principles, what values, what qualities is working for the kingdom of God orders us to do? To be followers of Christ, what do we need to do? And not whether that is going to be effective, whether that is politically acceptable, whether it is going to lead to a price or a cost, but what is the right thing to do? Do we really believe that weapons and more weapons for Israel solve any problem? Clearly we don't. Do we really believe that racism and inequality are bad? In fact, that anti-Semitism itself is a sin. And if we do, how can we submit to a system that forces Jews into this political framework of Zionism that makes their life miserable, both in Israel-Palestine and in whatever country they happen to live in? I know, under the tremendous weight of the Holocaust, people have been told that the answer is Zionism. The answer is a Jewish state, as Jewish as France is French. The answer is to support the only Jewish nation in the world today, when in fact, maybe what they need is not more support, but maybe some tough love. Maybe that we finally are willing to look at you as equal people and subject you to the same measures, principles, values, criticism that we subject everybody else. That we believe you are citizens, full citizens, and not only partial citizen with your loyalty maybe going to another country far away. That's a very difficult conversation to have, I know. But I think people in Israel today are open to that new conversation. And many really decent Jews in Canada and the United States are really conflicted by the actions of their government, of the Israeli government, not their government. And therefore they think they need to impact it. And that impact is not unqualified support for the state of Israel and its policies, but rather some tough love, some open conversations where the guiding principles are not what is politically feasible, but what is the right thing to do. What are the values of the kingdom of God? What is it that we believe in? What is it that we have learned from the terrible experience that we have gone through, from the Holocaust, from settler colonialism, from our own failures and inadequate responses to native indigenous populations? Can we, with all humility, share that lesson with Israelis, with Zionists, and tell them that there is a better way forward, both for you and for Palestinians? And it is not based on total domination. It's not based on Jewish supremacy or Arab supremacy. It is not based on creating a state that is Jewish, but rather creating a state where Jews can feel at home, but also Arabs and Palestinians can feel at home. It may be difficult to achieve. Maybe we simply approach that ideal situation as we do in all our work in a broken world working towards the kingdom of God. I'm sorry, I think I took more
Thank
time
you.
than I was.
Thank you. In the 4 remaining minutes, I invite the first 5 panelists, if you want to say a concluding word, something, a new insight, some inspiration. Basically, and you spoke about your church and action. If we think of the churches all together now and the role, any insight you got from this conversation that you think you can share to help strengthen the advocacy, the positions, to take position, where should, it seems we are naming a new moment from the beginning of what Jonathan described and what you're describing. There is a new, what is this calling us to? What is helping us see we didn't see before? Where are we going? Just a couple of thoughts. Carl.
I think there is life is made of particular moments, that how history is made, okay? And I think something happened about 2 years ago in the summer, remember, when there was problems with people that were expelled from their homes in East Jerusalem. And that led from the Hamas throwing a bunch of missiles, and then the counter reaction that was so to the extreme by Israel got a lot of red flags from the media, from people that suddenly witnessed something weird, the abuse on the Palestinian people, the unfairness. Why would you kick out just a family? Why? Because they don't have a permit that dates from the Ottoman Empire? What is this? And suddenly a story of the people came out on the screen, of all the screen. And what was interesting, Biden in the United States and Trudeau said the same thing when this first week started. Well, Israel has the right to defend itself. The whole line they've been throwing at us for the last 75 years. Not that it's not true. It's just the timing was wrong. It had nothing to do with that. And suddenly, the people started to see the story and then people from different groups started speaking loud and being interviewed. Suddenly, there was an interest. And a few days later, if you recall, Trudeau changed his line. Oh, we ask Israel to have moderation. Biden did the same thing because of the pressure within his own party and the pressure that happened here. That was a moment. I think there is an awakening. And this awakening is continuing because what's going on with Israel has not improved but gotten worse. And Israel is shooting itself on the foot themselves. They don't need us. We just have to pick it up from there and tell the facts. And I think the public is ready if we just take our time to continue to tell the story, because that moment just passed and history is being made now. So let's be part of it.
Any other thoughts? Carmen?
I really appreciate your responses, Mikhail, and I, as an Indigenous political theologian, we share many of the same things, and Dorcas and I sort of, we're both academics, and so we said we wish we could respond as theologians and scholars and not as church leaders. But I do think that education, especially for us in the United Church of Canada, the Theology Interchurch Interfaith Committee, and any advocacy and study groups need to also understand those concepts of settler colonialism and understand history, right? Like the Balfour Declaration that you mentioned, the Royal Commission on Palestine. People don't want to go back and read those documents, just like they don't want to go back and read the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal People here in Canada. But you cannot understand, like Erasmus wrote a beautiful, beautiful gift to Canada, 4,000 pages of history of settler colonialism and its impacts on people here. And the same thing happened with the Royal Commission on Palestine, which was before the creation of the State of Israel, about the potential consequences if the cultural realities between European Jews who had the right to escape anti-Semitism in Europe and to return to the land of Israel, but the Arab Jews, Christians, and Muslims who had lived there for thousands of years, and that there was a cultural difference that needed to be resolved. And that is really at the heart. And so I agree with you that like maybe it's time to change the dialogue. Yes, we need to be holding the state of Israel and Palestinians accountable under their respective obligations, which are not equal. There's the obligations of those who are occupied, and there are the obligations of those who are occupying under international law. But we need to also have this other conversation that changes the narrative and allows us to think back to the bigger picture about the intersections of history and culture.
Yes, please, Archbishop Nichols.
Just wanted to pick up on what Jonathan was just saying about the need to speak up, regardless of whether you have a solution. And I think one of the most disappointing moments of the last 2 days was speaking with an MP who I will not name. When that MP said, well, really, Canada has no voice because we have no economic power, we have no leverage, we have no, nobody will listen to us. So it was a very pragmatic approach that said, basically, there's no point in speaking up and don't bother us and don't push us. And we all left the room going, no, there is a reason to speak up. And the reason is because it's morally right to speak up. And that Canadians hold values around human rights that must be named and declared, even if we don't have a solution ready, even if we want to say what's happening is wrong. And we need to be, and I think what we've said here is about the need for partnerships across civil society, with Muslims, with Jews, with churches, with NGOs and other organizations that are committed to peace and justice. And that just because we don't have an economic skin in the game is not a reason not to speak.
Amen.
And we did, to this politician, we did say there is a moral imperative. And he said, no way. No way. It's economic and military power. We were so discouraged after that conversation. But, so I think I agree. That's where we have our strength, and we need to use that strength as best we can.
Bishop Johnson, any closing thoughts?
I think this has just been one of the moments when we learn that we're stronger together. We're stronger when we speak with one voice. We're stronger when we work together. We're stronger when we share resources. And the more partners we can bring into that conversation, the better we're going to be. We don't have to feel so small and so scared.
Very good. Yes. I feel that there will certainly be a follow-up to this event, like the movement of the Spirit in our hearts and minds is calling us something more, and we will certainly think about possible a little announcement that Professor Michael Seguin and myself just recently got a grant from the university for launching our strategic plan. There are several projects to take a group of students to Israel and Palestine next spring in 2024, and it's jointly supported by the School of Conflict Studies, Faculty of Theology, and School of Transformative Leadership, and open to all our students at the university and beyond. So that's one little action that's in the same spirit. But so I thought it would be good to announce that.
And then we'll go back on Parliament Hill with all of you.
Right. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to all the people who are online. Thanks to Jonathan joining us from the US. I'm not sure in which state. Thank you all. I know you have long days. You are on a marathon these days with all your meetings on the Hill and all the work. Thanks for making time to be here. You really inspired us, and as you said, we feel the strength of our collective action and being together. So thanks, and have a good night.